Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This is 447th episode for World Talent Economic Forum. We have our world famous entrepreneurs, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Mark, as well as Professor David. I want to give floor Mr. Marshall because he's expert on climate change as well as waste management. So what you want to share with our audience today, Mr. Marshall?
Thank you, Sharif. Thank you, Sharif. Can you hear me? You good? Okay,
Yes.
Great. So thank you for having us once again on your forum. Today's topic is the connection between a category known as green bonds and specifically a certain type of green bond known as the climate bonds out of the EU and how they're a bridge to sustainable development goals that have been established by the United Nations and why that's important. And so what we know, there are 17 goals that have been created by the United Nations, and they're called Sustainability Development Goals. And underneath that are a whole host of requirements that allow you to acquire the ability to say that you've achieved an SDG or a Sustainability Development Goal. In the last session that we had with Hina Shah, who unfortunately could not make this program because she's on her way to Iceland, and she's our SDG expert. She pointed out that for the European Union's climate bond, we are unique in that we meet 14 of the 17 SDGs, and we continue to work on the others. The most important thing is that the SDGs, there is an interplay between what is green, in other words, climate resilience and climate repair, and social goals, and the funding of these projects that allow us to achieve them. And these projects through the EU are done through joint ventures under a certain taxonomy, which is a set of rules. So I just want to introduce, that's the topic for today. And I'll go back to our host, Sharif, and we'll welcome any questions or anybody once we get through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Mr. Mark Sabin, especially when we discuss about climate bond, like what type of projects actually they can get support through climate bond? Example, we live in a developing nation, like country like Malaysia. We have more connections like Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Vietnam. These are the countries. There are many challenge actually happening, especially in the COVID-19 situations. They have problem in healthcare. They have problem in energy. They have problem in water and waste management. So, what area our audience, especially our government and our corporation, can focus?
Well, as you mentioned, the number of problems that you already have brought up are all issues that are actually addressed in the Sustainable Development Goals. So of the 17 goals, most of them relate in some manner or form and improving conditions planetarily. So we're talking about being able to end poverty. We're talking about being able to deal with ending hunger, with ensuring health, all the health issues that are going on. We obviously have this immediate problem that we've had with the COVID breakout infections. We also have a lot of environmental issues. So whether it's water or what's happening on the earth with land, farming, agriculture, all these issues are specifically addressed in those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There are also ones that deal with things like equality amongst people. So you may be dealing with gender equality, or you may be reducing inequality altogether. We have a lot of economic inequality globally. And then efforts towards peace. Now, one of the things that is part of the mix that Marshall was mentioning here about advanced resilient technology is that we have endeavored to design what we're doing in terms of the ventures that we place in these countries, right? And we're talking about putting ventures into third world nations. We want to be able to meet as many of those sustainable development goals as possible. because each one of those is going to help the local community in a significant way, as well as the global community. So if we're bringing in good paying jobs, if we're bringing in healthcare advocacy and facilities to be able to be brought into there, if we're promoting education so that the people in the local community are being educated and have opportunities for education, in addition to that, then the actual output of what we're doing in terms of the installations we're putting in, those things are dealing with water issues, cleaning water, with being able to facilitate better soil conditions for farmers. They're being able to deal with all these different things so that we're producing more food, so we're ending hunger. We're dealing with the poverty issues by supplying jobs. So all these things are happening that are being targeted by the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Professor David Smith, you are expert of public-private partnership. Besides that, from the developing nations, we are observing two things. Either in the Asia-Pacific, government projects, it's successful. Example, China Belt and Road Initiative is very successful. Or, example, in energy sectors, we are observing individual power producers, or I want to say more, the private corporations successful. If we observe these public-private partnerships, the success rate, I want to say it's very little, not so much. So you are expert of public-private partnerships. How we can make more successful public-private partnership in Asia-Pacific? This is number one. Number two, what are the strategy developing nations has to implement in their countries for these public-private partnerships?
Well, Sharif, public-private partnerships are really the key to them being successful is actually the last word. It has to be a partnership. And it's finding partners who understand that they have their roles, and a public-private partnership does not necessarily have to do everything within the principles of the public-private partnership. So what you do is in public-private partnerships, you get a very good definition of what you are trying to do with it. So just like any company, any startup, any large company. But then in public-private partnerships, you have to really begin to look more about the intersections, who's doing what, but where public-private partnerships fail, where joint ventures fail, is at the intersection points. Is how do you begin to cross over? One of the keys to me seeing them work is something you've heard me use the phrase before, is group intelligence. Anytime you begin to pull across those intersection points and use more group intelligence, the likelihood of a public-private partnership being successful go up dramatically. The other thing that really increases the success is, I call the pull factor, is many times in relationships, particularly public-private partnerships, the partnership, the P3, only tries to push what you're trying to do. So it says, if I build it, they will come. Well, that happens sometimes, but really what you have to do is create pull. You know, you've heard me use the analogy, it's easier to pull a rope than to push a rope. And in public-private partnerships, that's very true. It's because very often they're trying to put policy initiatives, they're trying to do major large-scale projects that are difficult. And you've got to create that pull to be successful as well, too. And like I said at the very start, it's also making sure you have the right resources. In many public-private partnerships I've seen that have failed, they were hesitant to pull in resources from outside the public-private partnership. They were hesitant to bring consultants in. They were hesitant to bring specialized capabilities in. But finding the right competencies and capabilities, and it really is competencies and capabilities, is the key to P3s being successful, whether the competencies and capabilities are embedded within the partners in the P3, or you have to bring them in from the outside. But those are some of the real things that help them be more successful.
Thank you, Professor David Smith. Mr. Marshall, you are a successful entrepreneur. Second things, you are an analyst. I want to say the climate change related things. Green bond is one of your key strategy you want to offer for the developing world. My question is that after COP26, what are the key strategy developing nations can follow as well as they can get more benefit through your green bonds?
That's an excellent question, Sharif. There's various green bonds out there. Some of them are known as ESG bonds. That stands for Environmental Sustainable Governance Bonds.
I think they would
We
do
have
too.
another one that is called Social Responsibility
I was going to step on with you. I think.
And then there's also one that is known as just the green bond. There's an actual bond called a green bond. So it's confusing because there's a green bond category, then there's a specific green bond. And then, of course, the one that we suggest and that we follow, the one that we would bring to the table, is the climate bonds that are issued by the EU currently. And the reason we would go with them is because those bonds are the only bonds that are rated by Fitch, Morningstar, and Moody's. Those are the rating agencies of bonds around the world. And the others are not rated. And the reason they're not rated is because they don't have the taxonomies, the stringent rules that prevent greenwashing from occurring. And greenwashing is a term that I want to bring to the table today. Greenwashing talks about people who make claims that they're going to do something for the environment, but in point of fact are not doing it. I can give numerous examples of it, but a basic example is somebody who says, well, I'm not going to issue any more CO2 into the atmosphere, so I'm going to get this green bond to help me finance that capability. Then they don't follow through, and what do? They issue CO2 into the atmosphere. That's called greenwashing. That's an example of it. So what is good about the EU climate bonds and the climate and run by the Climate Bond Initiative in Europe is that they have various taxonomies and rules. The one that we want to pursue immediately with the developing world are those bonds that are both waste management taxonomies, which essentially defined as turning brownfield entities defined in the EU, not in the US or not in Asia, but defined as in the EU. People who have brownfield entities, meaning they have waste of any kind. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a landfill operator. Of course, that would qualify, or a waste hauler. They would qualify, but so would a sawmill that has so much sawdust that it's burning it or burying it, which is not good, or some other entity that has a lot of waste. And what are they going to do with it? So they're just polluting the atmosphere. So that's a brownfield by definition in the EU. And we convert that 100%, not 95%, not 99%, 100% to a greenfield operation. That's what the joint venture does. And then what it does, it supports some of those 17 sustainable development goals that Mark spoke to. And they also work only through in the third world, let's say in Malaysia or Pakistan or Bangladesh or any of these other countries or Africa, through public-private partnerships are generally because most of the waste is handled by private entities, although by public entities. I'm sure there are some private entities that handle waste too. We can do those as well. But basically, in order to get the lift and the magnitude handled, we need the kind of funding that the climate bond can provide. And we have the technology that we can get to these locations where we can actually convert waste into products. Now, when I say products, I'm not talking about a shoe or an iPhone or an electronic vehicle. I'm talking about products that actually help mitigate risk to climate problems. So, for instance, What we do is we take waste and we convert it into a material known as biochar or elemental char. And that can be used for filtration media. It can be used in construction. It can be used in soil amendment, depending on what the source of the waste is. And it can be used in other projects. And it allows us to be able to solve soil health, improve soil health in the communities we're in, clean up water, which is really important, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also provide, if needed, power to the local community. So there's a lot of options here that we can bring to the table, but it needs to be done not by one entity, but it's what David said, it needs that lift of the private public sector to work together hand in glove. Now, we do have to follow the rules of the EU climate bond. They have specific rules. That's the taxonomies for each type of bond. So the first one we're talking about is waste management, which I defined. There's also agricultural bonds, as we discussed in a previous session. There's also construction bonds for green construction. There's also even bonds for cargo shipping. The original bonds that were issued in 2009 under the climate bonds were for hydroelectric, solar, and wind. So those were the original ones. All the bonds that have been issued to date have been oversubscribed. What that means is that they are sought after by investment houses that seek to set off what is known today as their ESG portfolio, their environmental sustainability and governance portfolio, so they can become more green and not be part of that greenwashing, but be part of a true contribution. Hopefully that answers your question, Sharif.
I have few things. I need to clear the jargon because for our audience. Number one, you always say taxonomy. Can you define this part, the taxonomy, for our audience? Because this is new for our audience, because when I discuss today with the academicians and the corporate and politicians, we need to clear this jargon from
Okay.
my side.
Yes.
Second thing, I have another things like when you discuss about char, like you are producing biochar. So what is the business model for your organization? Is it successful? Is it helpful for the corporations? Is it helpful for economical sustainability of your project?
Okay, so let me take the taxonomy first. So the taxonomy is essentially, it's a word that means defined rules of the road. In other words, what are the rules that are promulgated by any country? Now, generally, we don't call them taxonomies. We call them rules, or we call them laws in government. But in the financial sector, which is what this is, which is quasi-governmental, I mean, it is regulated by the EU, by the European Commission, and by the EU Parliament. That's who regulates the climate bonds in the EU. And of course, countries in the EU can issue these bonds. Anybody can issue these bonds. And we can issue these bonds anywhere in the world. It's just that we need to follow their rules of the road. In other words, that's what the taxonomy means. In other words, they have specified in writing what types of rules need to be met in order to get a specific type of bond. So the waste management bond, I gave you the overview. There's over 200 boxes to check off to get that, which we've qualified for. But to check those boxes off, the overview, the top-down view is you're turning a brown field into a green field 100%. How you go about doing that, there are other rules that you must follow so that you're not greenwashing or saying one thing and doing another. That's what we want to prevent. We want to prevent transparency. We want to prevent lack of transparency. We want to promulgate transparency. We want to show the bondholders that we are doing what we're saying we're doing. That's why those bonds are oversubscribed and the others are not. And that's why those bonds are monitored and tracked by Morningstar and all the other agencies that track bonds and give them a rating. The others don't even get ratings. They get no rating. Now they're working hard to try to move towards that, especially since COP26. COP26 changed the rules of the road. How so? Really, everybody that watched the media, and I'm sure the same thing was in Asia and Africa, as well as is in the Western world, like Europe and the United States. Everybody felt that the COP26 was a disappointment because the standards were so high. They were trying to get to a very high level. And the reason that everybody's trying to get there is because the scientists, not the politicians, the scientists and not the financial experts, but the scientists are showing that we are in a climate crisis. It's science. It has nothing to do with whether you like it or don't. You can't regulate the climate crisis. The climate crisis is a fact of mankind's pollution of this earth over the last 200 to 300 years. And it's accumulated over time. And we're getting to a point where we have significant events that are about to occur. Some will occur no matter what we do, but others we can prevent. And that's what this is about. We can help sustain people, get them in a better condition to withstand the climate crisis while achieving the 17 goals of the sustainability goals of the UN. And by the way, that's why the UN came up with these 17 goals, because they knew that time is of the essence. So from the taxonomy point of view, those are simply the rules of the road. And there's different taxonomies, quote unquote. But the climate bond has specific ones for specific types of bonds. And they issue to the buying public. In this case, it's mostly corporations that buy these bonds in large sums and oversubscribe because they want to share and want to show their shareholders and their stakeholders and their countries that they're doing the right thing. Now, under the Climate Bond Initiative, it's gotten tremendous publication and it came about that Europe is trying to create a circular economy. The good news is we believe, and we know that everybody on this panel believes, that we can help developing nations become circular economies as well. And we need to do this in a methodical approach, in a step-by-step approach. The other question that you asked is biochar. Now, biochar is an interesting material. It's a thermochemical conversion of waste, typically waste, normally woody biomass, into a material known as biochar. Some people confuse it with the term charcoal. Even the people in the industry sometimes refer to it as charcoal. Charcoal is not biochar. If you look at it under an electron microscope, they are totally different. The biochar is highly porous. It looks like a sponge, and it has huge surface area on it, whereas charcoal is highly dense and is used, and they both have carbon in it, by the way, and they're both black, and they both can be powdery or condensed, but they're different. And the process of creating them is different. And there's different technologies that create biochar, and there's different technologies that create charcoal. And some of them can happen in nature. So, for instance, in Western California, there were these huge fires, and a lot of people think that on the surface, the ash that fell on the surface is biochar. It's not. It's a form of charcoal because it's highly dense. And so some of it turns to biochar depending on the process in nature, but most of it is not. So what we find is that biochar is, because of its porosity, has great use in sequestering carbon and can be used in a multitude of methods. There was back in 2014, 2015, the Ithaca Institute published the 55 uses of biochar. Kathleen Draper and Albert Bates, both co-authors of Burn, How to Cool the Earth Using Fire, is a book that I recommend everybody go out and acquire and read. It shows that there's 100,000 markets. And myself, as the co-chair of Working Group 3 of the cost action paid for by the European Council and the European Parliament on biochar TB 1107 for the European Union, we discovered that there are many more than 100,000 markets. It's true that there's 100,000 markets if you use the term biochar, But it's a little confusing because a lot of people, when you go and you see what they're doing and you say, are you creating biochar? They'll look at you like you have two heads because they don't think of themselves as creating biochar. They are creating something else. And there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace, but that's going away as standards are created through the International Biochar Initiative. By the way, Kathleen Draper is the chairwoman of that. And of course, there's the European Union equivalent. And we're trying to get ANSBI, the Australian New Zealand Biochar Initiative, to go in that direction as well. And we believe they will. But there's tremendous progress with the term, what we call elemental char, but what other people call biochar. The term came out of the fact that you're taking organic material and you're converting it into this highly porous material. So they called it biochar. The problem is you can create porous material out of or in other words, inorganic material as well. And we've done it. So you can take organic and inorganic material. That's why we call it elemental char. But in any case, you could take that material and you can use it for a whole host of uses. And the good news is the organic biochar is recognized by the IPCC, right? We know who those folks are. That's the International Council that came out of that helped create the COP26 meeting from the UN. And the IPCC has recognized biochar as being one of the 6 tools to sequester carbon in the world. So it's an important product and an important material. The other issue about biochar is that in order to manufacture that material for the different uses, you need to scale up. And the largest scale that we know of, other than our own, is found in Finland and found in Stockholm, Sweden, and found in Mississauga, Canada, and 3 in Hunan, China. And they process 10 metric tons a day per machine of waste into about 17 to 24% biochar. Our system, by contrast, handles 120 metric tons a day of waste of just one machine and converts that into approximately 30 to 40 metric tons of biochar if it's organic. If it's inorganic, it's the same material. We just don't call it biochar. We call it elemental char. So basically, and it can be used for different markets in different places around the world. We know where the markets are. We know what the price points are. We can put together with our joint venture partners in Malaysia, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, anywhere throughout Africa. We formed joint public-private partnerships with joint ventures under the waste management taxonomy or the agricultural taxonomy for the climate bond. And the good news is the banks act as guarantors, which we'll talk about next Wednesday, not next Tuesday, but next Wednesday, as blended finance. And that protects the central banks or the specific bank that's helping to bring the funding to the table. They actually don't bring the funding, Sharif. What they do is they act as a guarantor to the funding during the process of our obtaining the climate bond. Once we obtain the climate bond, then the joint venture obtains the cash from that climate bond to get the project done under those rules, that taxonomy that we spoke about before, that is specific for that particular type of climate bond, whether it's waste management taxonomy, agricultural taxonomy, or green building taxonomy as 3 examples alone. Hopefully that answers your question on taxonomy.
Excellent. Mr. Mark, one of the specific things right now, the developing nations, because developing nations has different challenges. Europe, North America, they have different economy, different culture, different challenges. So when we are discussing about circular economy, because I'm from developing nations, I can understand in my childhood, we do not have electricity. So when this government come in Bangladesh, first they introducing a lot of coal or HFO based power plant because our country need emergency basis power plant. Then we now step by step our economy and everything growing. Now step by step we are now focusing on like solar energy, wind power. These are the things. These are very basic. These are very basic story of the developing world. First, they just want to survive. So first, they want to build up their economy. Then they go for this climate change related projects, these economical sustainability issues. But my question is that in this COVID-19 situation, that is the fact, many countries struggling with their economic sustainability, especially especially Asia Pacific, they are more based on manufacturing. Example, the developed world, let's say USA is I want to say the service based industry. Asia Pacific more on manufacturing based countries, they are struggling a lot. In that situation, your corporations or this team offering circular economy for developing nations, why you believe that circular economy and this kind of strategy will be helpful for developing world in this economic challenging situation?
Well, that's a great question, Sharif, and really it comes down to kind of the two sides of what this project actually provides. Marshall was just talking about the manufacturing of the char, which is one aspect of what comes out of these machines as they process waste. But the one of the key to how this actually helps in the economies is that we are dealing with a global waste problem and the accumulation of waste, which is creating a lot of devastation to the economies and to the environments of these nations. And we need to be able to deal with that. But not only do we want to just deal with the waste problem, but these systems then produce something that becomes a viable product. So they're manufacturing out of what was waste and turning it into a renewable, reusable, basically a new resource, which becomes the foundation for other products, which can then be turned around and be used in the local economies for various functions. So whether the problem is simply because there's an accumulation of inorganic waste that needs to be handled and dealt with, that can then be turned around into construction material, which can be then used for building more of the infrastructure that the nation needs in order to turn its economy around. If we're talking about organic waste, that waste can then be turned around and be used to help clean up the environment so that we mitigate some of the damage that has been done over the years, over the centuries even, and be able to turn what's happening to the environment around so that now it becomes more productive. So the agriculture becomes more productive. If you're talking about aquaculture, you can also clean up as you're cleaning up the water. So we know that there are a lot of fish farms and shrimp farms that are around in some of the nations that we're talking about. Those need to be able to deal with reducing the mortality of what's happening to the fish, reduction of mortality amongst other livestock that goes into the food chain, so we can increase the production on that level. The other factor that we have in this is that because these systems, as they're treating the waste, do produce a certain amount of energy. So they're also being able to provide in these locations more power, more electricity, so that again, this helps facilitate the local economy in a broad way. And by doing all these various things, all the components lining up together, and this is part of the business model that we were talking about, is that the whole notion here is, and the reason that Advanced Resilient Technology addresses 14 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is because the model has been set up in such a way to be able to answer the dilemma that we're facing in third world countries and in first world countries even, about the environmental issues, but also the economic issues, because those two things are absolutely tied together. And if we don't solve both problems at the same time, we're going to find ourselves still living with these same problems and not actually moving the world forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Mark. Professor David Smith, you are running one of the largest corporation, ETT, as a CTO. So even you work with some developing nations like Pakistan and the Asia Pacific other countries. My questions to you in this challenging moment, if as you are expert of developing nations and public-private partnerships, if I want a case study that how your corporation go for SWOT analysis in these situations, how you want to do that, or how you want to analyze the developing nation's economy based on SWOT, like strength, weakness, opportunities, and threat.
Well, Sharif, great question, because as you begin to look, particularly in the areas that we're focused on this today, in the waste area, and that there's a lot of places you can begin to look at examples. The technology at Marshall is talked about. There's cases where you can go and look at them. There's another technology, as opposed to using wood, that uses more agricultural products to produce biomass and energy and things from that. Good case examples of those. But I can tell you, based on our experience, oftentimes as you begin to go in and look at funding this type of projects, you've got to look broader around it and make sure the other elements, particularly in developing nations, are covered. Give you a SWOT analysis of a project we're involved with now, in that there was a region in the country that had been overfarmed. The trees were almost non-existent. Plants have just been overfarmed. The ground almost was useless for agriculture again. The cattle production had eaten everything around. They didn't have consistent sources of electricity that were on 24 hours a day. They were on again, off again. And you have to begin to look at those type of problems too, because you have to say, how can I make sure we have electricity to do a lot of these things? It's hard to do a lot of waste management without electricity. This particular country, when we got in and started looking, over half of the computers used by the government were running Windows XP. Much of the new software will not run on Windows XP. So we had to look at that type of issue too. And can we upgrade them, or do we have to find software that will run in that environment and that can be run going forward? So that those other external factors, and when you're doing a SWOT analysis of these types of projects, become real important to understand. In this country's instance, we actually, in doing our analysis, made the determination not to upgrade all of those PCs to Windows 10 because it was too much of a learning curve for the citizens. And they had much of their own software that would have been broken by upgrading to the new stuff. So what we did instead is had to go and find software and convert it that would run in that environment. And so that was a side project that significantly contributed to the ongoing success of that, which was not the exact same problem we were trying to solve. And in developing nations, you'll see those type of issues more common than you think. In this country, the region we were dealing in, in this country, only 24 cities have internet coverage, and the rest of the nation really does not. So part of what we did there is we established a wireless mesh internet coverage, not using the traditional means you would see in a developing nation, but using other things. So there we used a self-healing mesh of wireless Wi-Fi, not LTE, not cellular based, not even 5G, because the cell things have to be so small. But with the right transmitter receivers and antennas, you can make a Wi-Fi signal go 20 miles. And it's not like what we see in our homes and our companies. But you have to begin to look at things like that. And we got the basic Wi-Fi out there to people who had not had it, so that they could manage these public-private partnerships as they impacted it. One other point I'd like to make about what makes public-private partnerships more successful in the case study is if we can involve academia. It might not be a research university. It could be a community college. It could be a trade school. Educating people to be able to work with the solutions coming in is key important. I can tell you when Semitech, which is a semiconductor consortia, so it's a form of a public-private partnership, came to Austin to help solve the U.S. semiconductor problems. We went out to the community colleges, not just in Austin, but in the communities around it, and we put programs in place to train technicians. We put programs in place to explicitly train material handlers, particularly as you look at some of the advanced chemicals you use in semiconductor manufacturing stuff. Those are the other elements where academia, and that term's very broad. I mean, it could be a boot camp, needs to be involved to be able to be part of the public-private partnership, to be able to solve these issues. Because you're solving big problems, it takes an ecosystem approach. And so the Technopolis concept I talked about last time is really one where you pull together the government at multiple layers, you pull together the commercial interests at multiple layers, and you pull together the academic, again, at multiple layers to be successful in solving these types of problems.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent analysis. Mr. Marshall, I want to be a little bit of harsh for you because we are sharing some of the evidence with you, but definitely we want to learn from your strategy. That is our objective. It's not the criticize. We do not like criticize. We only love to learn. Let's say this is a report from Guardians. Definitely it's 8 month old. We are discussing after 8 months. And they are sharing that wealthy nation fails to help developing world tackle climate crisis. Okay, according to
Yes.
Guardians. Yes.
Yes.
So yes, like Biden administration, they are taking initiative. Biden administration declared.
Have a great week, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
So in that situations, what you are offering, this is something different. Definitely, this is positive as well because you are offering something good for developing world. Do you believe that your offer, especially the climate bond, and these are the things will be really helpful in the futures, or it will be like the previous one, only the commitment?
That's an excellent question, Sharif, and it's a very challenging question, and it's a question that needs to be brought up. It's not something that we want to bypass. That's part of the greenwashing that I talked about before. We need transparency, but we also need action, and we need action now. So we have brought together a series of elements, as David discussed, that it's a private-public partnership, the 3P approach, that when combined can have success. And as David pointed out, there are examples of success. There's many examples of failure, but that doesn't mean we should stop working on this. There's Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb. A reporter in New York City went up to him back in the 1800s and said to him, or the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he said, "Mr. Edison, I understand you had 200,000 failures. How do you keep working?" And he said, "I didn't have 200,000 failures. I had 200,000 experiments to get the light bulb to work." That's what we're doing. We're trying to get the light bulb to work. In this case, the light bulb is what? The light bulb is that the countries, the developing nations need to act now. And we believe that, yes, first world nations have let down third world nations, but we don't believe that that has to continue. It's our belief that the climate bond, which is been regulated by the EU, gives us a whole set of opportunities, not problems, but opportunities to take the threats to these nations and turn them into better health, better water, better soil, better air quality, and create jobs at the same time, good paying jobs for each country in its area, and lift the people to make a middle class and a better educated populace. We need to educate people. It's one of the SDGs. It's one of the Sustainability Development Goals. That's, by the way, where we see the World Economic Talent Forum being very important here for the developing nations. You're very keyed on education and providing education, such as I remember in one of our previous panels, you talked about bringing 100 Rwandan women to the table. You get 2 SDGs out of that. One is education, and the other one is helping women, which is the ones that Mark talked about. So in essence, what we need to do is we need to act now. We have a game plan, a framework in which we can bring the EU kicking and screaming to the table, but they're not kicking or screaming. They want to see this happen. This is a method in which people will invest outside. Corporations will invest in our sustainability projects that are joint ventures under the EU taxonomy that will create these jobs, create this education, create all these targets of the Sustainable Development Goals that we're trying to achieve through the Climate Bond Initiative and acquiring a climate bond to fund the projects in country. The good news is that to do that, we have to create jobs in Europe. I'm not going to hide that, because otherwise, why would the EU want to give us the requirement that we meet the requirement? One of the requirements is we create jobs. So we do. We have the ability to manufacture our technology in Italy, which is considered the poor man of Western Europe, not the poor man of Europe, but the poor man of Western Europe. We create jobs there. And those manufactured systems, people have asked me, are those systems ISO certified? So, ISO certification is the requirement that the manufactured product actually meets certain requirements. Yes. So our technology, when manufactured, meets ISO 9002, 14001. By the way, 14001 is the one that's really important for the SDGs because it's about the environment. And there's other ISO certifications that we meet. Those are worldwide standards that we can apply, that every manufacturer around the world, whether they're manufacturers in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Rwanda, or the United States, they all recognize the same standard. So we're not talking about different standards. So when we talk about standards, we're talking about the standards that we meet and we bring to the table. The other component that people ask us about, obviously about what we're doing, is are you really going to make a difference in people's lives? Well, the only way that will happen, and we can only say this, is that we need to form these private partners, public partner relationships as joint ventures under the EU directives. And then we get the money, we bring the money. So if, an example, if a Bank of Malaysia acts as our guarantor, they act as the guarantor for a limited period of time, but they actually help us bring the money from investors outside of Malaysia, from Europe and around the world. First world nations are mostly, the investors in these climate bonds are large institutions, financial institutions that are not going to let us down. Maybe the countries are, maybe the politics are, but in terms of the investment, which is a big deal, not just the science is there, but now we have the financial mechanism to risk mitigate to the developing world a means of getting funds in and getting the projects done under those rules. If we do that, we will see an exponential growth in cleaner water, better soil, cleaner air, and better jobs, and increased viability for the people that live in those communities. That's because it's a private-public partnership. We'll have as much a say as our partners, but our partners are the regulators in that country. So they have to help us get to those goals. They have to share the same goal set. That's why the 17 SDGs are important. Do they share those goals? There are a lot of people that give lip service to it. That's what you were talking about just now. You know, the first world has let down the third world because they're giving lip service to these SDGs that were created by the UN. We're not. We can actually show that we can meet 14 of the 17, and we're working on the others as we proceed. One of the ones that we don't currently meet, but we're about to, is the one that has to do with, I'm trying to remember which one it is. I think it's gender equality. We need more women in our organization. So we're reaching out. When we get this funding, we're going to be hiring women in country and around the world. And Hina Shah is a classic example of that. She's 28 years old. She is a civil engineer, and she's an environmental engineer. Who knew? But she's smart. You saw her last week. She really can articulate what the SDGs are about. And she was trained and certified in Washington, D.C. And of course, she took for the UN on SDGs. That's an example of the kind of availability and capability that we need to keep pushing the envelope on these SDGs. And the more we do it, the better everybody will be, the better off everyone will be.
Excellent, Mr. Marshall.
Sorry, if I could just add to something that Marshall was talking about, because I think this is important in terms of your question about the fact that the First Nations have let down the third world over time. And one of the things that the climate bond is enabling us to do, and that the model that we've created is enabling us to do, is to be able to bring the financial tools into the locations where the waste is, because the waste is now the resource. And since that is the resource that we're using and we're processing, that becomes economically viable, both for the local economy, but also to sustain what's happening out of the European Union, where they want to be able to build the technology in Italy, as Marshall was saying, but that technology is being deployed in the third world nations. So this climate bond is actually enabling this global outreach in a different way than we've seen before. So what was happening 8 months ago that was reported in The Guardian is now being shifted by what this opportunity is and by the model that ART has put together to be able to bridge that first world and third world needs and supplies to be able to meet the global demand. Because one of the things that the climate bond enables us to do, and I mentioned this last week, is really this is an infrastructure lift. This has to be done at an infrastructure level, not just a little project here and there, but actually a global change, because this is the situation that we're facing with climate change, that we're actually facing, and that each of these nations needs to do whatever they can to be able to mitigate the problems that are happening in a way that supports the economy, the people, and the environment.
Excellent. Professor David, you want to add some point on that particular issue, especially the responsibility of the developed world?
Well, I agree. As you look there, is it takes that initiative to go there, and it takes really the participation of the funding agencies. You know, both the people who are putting the bonds in place, and if you do supplemental funding through groups like the World Bank or International Development Bank or USAID or others. Oftentimes on projects like this, you'll have multiple people coming in to work as well in the P3 and the funding side. And it's understanding all of those. But there's a point that Marshall made that's very important, is that oftentimes these P3 initiatives are also increasing the employment in the developing nation, that you want to do that as much as possible. You want to hire locally to develop this because you create the knowledge base that can sustain it. If you look at one of the failures going back, particularly when you look at EU-based funding and some others like that, is the sustainability. You go in, you start it while you've got the funding, but then as soon as the funding goes away, the project dies, the benefits die. And so you've got to look at a way to make these sustainable. and it's through involving the local people, involving the other elements, looking at ways before the project is over to make them sustainable. And that's one of the other secrets for this being high impact for developing nations.
Excellent, excellent. This is really excellent point. And specifically, I request all of the developing nations, peoples, corporations, and especially government. This is the way you have to negotiate. We have to negotiate with the developed worlds. There are many good people like Mr. Marshall, Mr. Mark, Mr. David Smith. They are human. So if you can negotiate, you can get the maximum result for developing world. And that is the objective of World Talent Economy Forum. We are connecting the dots. We are developing the dialogue. We are arranging debate. We are arranging public-private partnership dialogue, conference. That is the issues, because we have to open up. We have to open up our relationship. We have to make more good relationship with the corporate of the first world, with the government of the first world, with the academy of the first world. Then we can learn, we can grow, and we can conquer. That is World Talent Economy Forum objective. And beside that, from Mr. Marshall, you are also, and with Professor David Smith and Mr. Mark Sabin, you are actually doing a great job. Definitely World Talent Economy Forum, definitely grateful to your contribution. Even, yes, I also get support in my student life from the European Union. I know that they have some strong commitment for the developing world. I go to the Ivy League universities or other universities with the help of developed world. Second things, even as your organization is ISO certified from 2009, I'm also corporate lead auditors for Bureau Veritas. So I know when there is the ISO certifications, there are a lot of procedures. My first PhD actually on gender inequalities. My first PhD on glass ceiling factors. So I work in Malaysian academy, especially the glass ceiling factor. So developing world also has to improve. So as your organization taking a lot of initiative, especially in this area, this is the major challenges and we have to work. And definitely waste is very important and we need to solve the problem. Environment pollutions, definitely major challenges for the developing world. We have to solve the problem. We need continuous support. We never has to stop. If anything fail, we have to try again. That is the way of getting success. And this is the way we believe that we can get ultimately result. So thank you everyone for joining today's session, and especially this kind of sessions is very, very, very important for the developing world. You have to understand how to do negotiate and how to get maximum result from the negotiation of the developed world. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. First, I request Mr. Mark, what is your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I just want to thank you, Sharif, for hosting this event. I think this is really important, and I just want to re-emphasize the fact, because I think your last question is maybe perhaps the most relevant question that we discussed here today, which is that we need to bridge, and what the World Economic Forum is about being able to bridge these two, what have been disparate worlds, which have been self-serving. Particularly the first world, I would say, is more self-serving than the third world, but we need to be able to bring the resources that are available financially into the third world so that the third world can become financially viable itself, and to be able to mitigate the problems that we have created over the last several hundred years with the damage that we've done to the environment because we didn't know better. But now we know better now, and we need to be able to take the initiative, and as you said, we have to try and try again, and if something fails, but this is kind of the entrepreneurial spirit that we bring into this mix that is so important to be able to do this. There is a quality that you need to try and try again. If you fail, you get back up and you get back on and you start again. And this is part of the process that has been what our mission has been, and our mission is to, again, to deal with the three aspects of what we call the triple bottom line economy, where we're supporting the people, we're supporting the planet, and we're supporting the profits that are necessary to be able to make an economical, viable world for the people who are living in it. And that includes education, that includes health, that includes nutrition. It includes all these aspects, it includes gender equality, includes all these aspects together into one holistic approach to solving the global problems that we're facing in a positive way, where we're not just looking at them as problems, but we're looking at solutions.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks?
Mark's done a great job of summarizing it. I think as you look at what Mark said to build up on it, particularly if you look at waste and climate change, is you have to look abroad the sectors, because we see waste in a way that is in the food chain. We see waste as plastic that's impacting. You see waste in so many different ways that it's a problem that affects not only climate change, but also affects quality of life. It affects the way we will work as human beings. And as we look at how we solve the climate change and manage our waste more effectively, it's an ecosystem view. And it's a cycle. I mean, we have to produce food to eat. Food to eat generates waste in the production of food. It generates waste after we eat it. It generates it all the way around. But how do you create a sustainable ecosystem that can address climate change as well? Sustainability is going to be very important as we address these problems going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor David Smith. Mr. Marshall, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, first of all, Sharif, thank you very much for hosting this panel. This is an extremely important panel, as both David and Mark have pointed out. And the topic of waste and climate change play a significant role in the Sustainability Development Goals. In fact, the overarching theme of the Sustainability Development Goals of the UN are climate. Everything connects to climate. So we need to address that. We have a mechanism to do that. The ability for it to be funded in part by, not in part, but in whole by a climate bond, by an EU climate bond, but backed by the local authorities through a public-private partnership and through, let's say, a development bank or a central bank or a private bank in that country, will help increase the adoption of what we're doing and create an opportunity for people to look to us, Sharif, to look to all the people that are participating in this as the answer to many issues that we're addressing through the Sustainability Development Goals, all 17 of them. Again, we only meet 14, but we're working on number 15, and we're going to go to 16. Some of them, I think one or two of them, we can't meet because we can't meet them unless we have a public-private partnership, because those other two out there are really built in at the government level, whether it's a local government, a city government, or a state government, or a countrywide government. Those goals need to be mandated by those parties together with us to meet those goals. But I think we've got a good opportunity now to launch this and get going as soon as possible. I would just like to give a preview that if I remember, Sharif, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you and I discussed that our next session will be not a week from today, but it will be a Wednesday from today, not tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow. And we will have on our panel people that can speak to the topic of blended finance. It's a form of finance that came out post COP26 in a new way. It's a new asset class, but it's backed and it's being used. We need to use that to address the issues we talked about today on today's panel of the connection between green bonds, or the climate bonds specifically, and the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So thank you, Sharif, for having us. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Thank you, Mr. Mark. And thank you, Professor David Smith, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Besides that, we need more positive enthusiastic entrepreneur for the developing world, because developing nations has lot of challenges, lot of problems. They need lot of solutions. So we want to welcome Mr. Marshall, Mr. David Smith, Mr. Mark Sabin to the developing world to solve many problems. Hopefully your initiative will be successful, and definitely World Talent Economy Forum will support all of your initiative. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye bye. Take care.